Edward, are you ready? Lay down. Good boy. Good boy. Okay, Ed. You ready? Touch. Good boy, now sit. Good boy. Now, Edward. Find John? Find John. Where is he? Where's John? Where is he? Where's John? Go get him.
Let's talk about learned behaviors. Last time we were talking about innate behaviors, and the thing about innate behaviors is they don't really change over time. They're genetically hardwired. When you're a little baby, if you put your hand too close to a fire, you're going to pull it away. You're going to rear it away. That's a good reflex to have, and reflexes are one category of innate behavior. But when you are very, say you're 90 years old, you put your hand too close to a candle, you're still going to have that reflex to pull it away. Reflexes and other innate behaviors, taxis, fixed action patterns, those sorts of things, they don't really change over time. But learned behaviors are different. Learned behavior, you can modify your own behavior with some experience. So what's happening in this clip? We have a mama bear who's catching some fish here. And why is she catching fish? Well, obviously so she can feed herself. But how did she learn how to catch that fish? She watched her mama bear do it. And now she's showing this to her cubs. This hunting behavior, knowing where to stand in a stream and when to show up at that stream so that the salmon are trying to get upstream and you can just catch them right away, that is something that is a learned behavior for bears. And mammals, we are very good. We take care of our offspring for a very long period of time. So we rely on these kind of learned behaviors in order to guide us along the way. So learning is a situation where you modify your behavior based on your experiences. In this case, these cubs are modifying their hunting behavior based on their observations of their mother, based on their experiences. Just like we talked about different categories of innate behaviors, we have different categories of learned behavior. So we're going to start out with imprinting. And the reason I want to start with imprinting is because it's kind of borderline between innate and learned behaviors. Imprinting is what baby birds, baby geese in particular, and ducks, some other birds as well, do as soon as they are born. They learn what their mother looks like, and then they follow her around. That process of learning what she looks like and then fixating on her, that's called imprinting. It's innate because baby birds will do this as soon as they're born. They don't need to be taught to do imprinting, they just will do imprinting. But it's also got a learned component involved as well, because they first must learn what their mother looks like. As it turns out, the stimulus for deciding which object in their immediate area is their mother is just the first thing that they see kind of moving towards and away from them, the first thing kind of moving around. Usually that is going to actually be their mother, so they will imprint on their mother, and baby geese that stay close to their mothers are going to have a survival advantage over those that do not. So the gene for imprinting is going to be selected for. But if you raise geese in a lab and separate them from their mother, then when they hatch, if you are the first thing that they see during this sensitive period, they will imprint on you instead. So here we have a scientist, and he's walking along. He's got a bike horn to make it sound like a goose mama call to make them feel a little bit better, but they have imprinted on him. So wherever he goes for their first year of life, they are going to be following right behind. Conservation biologists actually use the fact that whooping cranes will do this imprinting behavior for trying to restore their populations. As humans have spread out and we've built more parking lots and more housing developments and more shopping centers, all this kind of thing, we've needed space to move into, and a lot of that space ends up being natural habitat, sometimes very biodiverse natural habitat like wetlands where these cranes would live. So everywhere where these cranes would live, we have filled in with other types of purposes. Habitat destruction, this is called. We'll get to it in the ecology section a little bit later on. Whooping cranes are migratory. So that what they would usually do is migrate from one home wetland, and then they would go way, 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 way down south, but they would hit several wetlands on the way. And this is another reason why wetlands are so biodiverse. Often migratory birds use them as kind of stopover points, pit stop points, in order to rest and get a meal, and then they take off on the way. But their traditional migratory patterns were being disrupted from all the habitat destruction. And that migratory route was a learned thing. It was something that they had to experience. They had to fly it with their parents in order to learn it, and then they would continue using that route. But it was not useful to them anymore. So what did these scientists do? These scientists put on crane costumes. I don't know if you noticed yet, but he's holding a little puppet crane head in his hand on the picture on the left. He put on a crane costume, and they had the birds imprint on them, and then they got into these little microlight planes when they were old enough to fly, and they taught them a new migratory route, and then those cranes were able to teach that to their offspring, and suddenly they were able to bring their population back a little bit using this imprinting idea. Now, I should say that the point of the crane suit is not to fool the whooping cranes into thinking that you are a crane. You know, it's hard to know what animals think about things a lot of time, but that's not really the purpose. The actual reason is just so that they don't think that you're a human. They don't want them to become imprinted on the image of humans, because then they would probably go into human-dominated areas, into traffic. It would be very, very dangerous for them. So they put on the costume not to fool the birds into thinking they're a crane, but just to fool the birds into thinking that they're not humans, or to prevent them from imprinting on the image of humans. So this is one nice little use of these learned behaviors, of imprinting at least. Next category of learned behavior we can talk about, associative learning, which we'll cut up into a couple of subcategories as well. Associative learning is a process by which organisms pair two concepts, two stimuli and a behavior. They pair two things together in their environment. Associative learning is generally what we use in order to, say, teach a pet a new trick or something like that. And it's how organisms learn to avoid certain food sources. Like this caterpillar here has a very, very toxic, nasty taste. And this mouse, when it sees that bright, stripy coloration, if it gets that nasty taste in its mouth, it's going to start to associate those two very strong stimuli, the bright, stripy coloration and the nasty, toxic taste in its mouth, that kind of bitter compound, and maybe it'll avoid things that look like that in the future. It'll avoid that caterpillar. That is associative learning. It's associated those two concepts. For example, in classical conditioning, everyone knows about classical conditioning, Pavlov and his dog, right? It's a type of associative learning in which some arbitrary stimulus is associated with either reward or punishment. And the classic experiment for this is Pavlov's dog. So what do I mean when I say arbitrary stimulus? I mean it could be anything. That's what arbitrary means. It's not important what it is. In Pavlov's case, he used a bell, but it could just as easily have been a word or a light coming on in one part of the lab, or it could have been a particular music. The bell was just a very simple arbitrary stimulus to pick. And the reward or punishment that Pavlov used was meat powder. Okay, so here's how this worked. Every single time he gave meat powder, this kind of very, very dry, savory substance, to a dog, he would ring the bell. And what if you eat something that's very dry and savory, what are you going to do? You're going to start salivating all over the place. So the dog just started drooling and drooling and drooling, producing this saliva in anticipation of that meat powder. And then he would ring the bell. So we have two stimuli that are being paired together in the dog's brain. The meat powder and the bell. Meat powder, bell. Meat powder, bell. And then bell, but no meat powder. What did the dog do when he rang the bell with no meat powder after a long time of pairing these two things together? Well, the dog, I'm sure, was looking for the meat powder, but his body, his physiological state shifted into gear in anticipation of that meat powder. For so long, he had been hearing this bell and then producing saliva as a result of the meat powder that he began salivating, gushing saliva gushing drool out of his mouth just because the bell had rung. Now, salivating is not really something a dog can think to do. They can't decide to start drooling all over the place. So that is a physiological response. In his central nervous system, some switch had been flipped in order to pair that bell with that particular physiological response. That's classical conditioning. The meat powder is our reward, the bell is the arbitrary stimulus. And like I said, the bell could have been anything. That's what arbitrary means. Light turning on or off, or whatever it happens to be. Operant conditioning is a different kind of associative learning. In operant conditioning, an animal is going to pair one of its own behaviors with reward or punishment, not an arbitrary stimulus, one of its own behaviors. So for instance, if you have a predator that's hunting for meat and it sees this guy right here to the side of my window here, it sees this porcupine out there, might try to eat him. But then it's going to get a face full of needles as a result. And that's probably going to disincentivize that predator from trying to eat a porcupine again. So one of its own behaviors, its hunting behavior, will then be modified. It's going to change what it does. If it gets a whiff of that porcupine again, it's going to look elsewhere for food. It's modified its own behavior as a response to a reward or punishment. Operant conditioning is one component of what we use to teach animals tricks, but also there's some classical conditioning involved in there also. Let me show you. If you want to train a dog to sit on command, one of the best ways to do it is just to wait for the dog to sit on their own, just of their own accord. They get tired, they sit down, and then you say, sit, good boy, sit, right? And what is that word sit? Well, it doesn't really mean anything to the dog. They can't understand English. So the word sit is an arbitrary stimulus, right? It could be anything. You could tell them pina colada every time they sit down, and they will sit when you say pina colada. The word is meaningless. My dog responds to English commands, but my brother's dog responds to commands in a different language because the words don't really mean anything to the dog. It's an arbitrary stimulus. The actual sitting, though, that's a behavior, right? Sitting is a behavior. I mean, we can't just train a dog to sit just with association between the stimulus and the behavior itself. We need something like a reward or punishment. A reward. Now, what have we learned about classical conditioning and operant conditioning? Classical conditioning is when you pair an arbitrary stimulus, the word sit, with a reward or punishment, the treat in this case. Operant conditioning is when you pair a behavior, the actual act of sitting, with a reward or punishment. So when we teach a dog to do a trick, when we teach them that sit means you sit down, we need to actually use both classical conditioning and operant conditioning so that all three of these concepts get linked together. The arbitrary stimulus, the command, the behavior of sitting, and the reward or punishment, the treat. Now eventually, once you've gotten all these things locked in together, you can actually remove the treat. Just like with classical conditioning, with Pavlov's dog, you had the situation where you rang the bell and the dog still started salivating as a result, even in the absence of the actual meat powder. The dog will learn to pair this sit command with the behavior of sitting. Now, eventually, dogs might stop responding if you do not reward them. You wouldn't keep showing up to work if you weren't being paid. But that's due to another form of learned behavior. That is called habituation. In habituation, some of the associations that an animal has gained through classical conditioning or operant conditioning can be lost over time. Or sometimes, in some cases, even what might be an innate response could be slowly diminished over time with continuous exposure to certain stimuli. So, for example, rats, like a lot of animals, have a startle reflex. They hear a loud noise, they seize up, and they'll often just freeze right there. But if that loud noise gets played over and over and over and over again with no punishment of any kind, no reward or punishment, slowly they'll start to ignore it. And we're used to this kind of thing as well. If you move into like the city for the first time, right, and you try to sleep at night, oh my God, you can hear the train all over the place and people are shouting outside and there's car horns and you can't sleep. But after you've been there for like a month or two, you're habituated to that. You no longer respond to those stimuli and you can start sleeping through the night. So habituation is the diminishing of a physiological or emotional response to repeated stimuli without any kind of punishment or reward being attached to it. You lose association. This is non-associative learning. And through habituation, you can unlink two features of your environment. So let's say that you've got the dog to learn its trick, right? You've taught it sit means sitting down, and you no longer need the treat. It'll keep doing it even without the treat. But the longer you do that, the more and more times you say sit and there's no reward for it, eventually it's going to lose this association. There's no reason for it to keep doing it, right? Like I say, you wouldn't keep showing up to work if you weren't being paid. The dog won't keep sitting unless there's something to reinforce that behavior. Now, that does not have to be a treat. It could be praise. It could be playing with a toy that they really, really like. But if you want these behaviors to continue, you need some kind of reinforcement mechanism, or else habituation is going to diminish that response. We started this video with a clip of my dog Edward looking for me around the house. Now, he found me pretty fast that time, but he'll spend up to 15 minutes looking for me if I found a really, really good hiding spot. Now, that's a trick we taught him. We used operant and classical conditioning in order to have him pair the word find with that behavior of searching for us. But it also is a trick that requires a little something more. It requires a bit of cognition. Cognition is a process of knowing that involves awareness and reason and judgment and recollection. It's thinking about things. It's problem-solving type behavior. So what does my dog do when he hears that command find? Well, first he realizes that someone's missing from the room and he needs to go collect them. He knows that he gets his reward if he touches his nose to the person who is missing. That's his victory condition. So what does he do? He goes to the furthest room away. He usually starts in our bedroom and looks under beds, he looks behind doors, he looks behind cabinets, he looks in the closet, and then once he's checked all those spots, he moves out of that room and then he goes into our guest room. And then he looks under there, he looks under the turtles tank, and he looks all over the place, and then he crosses that one off of his list. Now, when he comes back into the hallway, he could just go back into the bedroom again, but he remembers he's crossed that off his list. Recollection. He remembers part of this, and his strategy is to systematically move through the house. That's a judgment call. He reasoned his way through it. And he'll keep doing this until he eventually finds me. So this is cognition and problem solving. And it turns out that lots of animals are very good at specific kinds of puzzles. If you give them the kinds of puzzles that they are able to solve, they can surprise you. We used to think about cognition and problem solving as a thing that only humans could do, but there's very few things that if you really nail it down with a concrete definition, that only humans can do. So for example, even very, very simple organisms, insects are not very intelligent in most ways. You wouldn't think of them as being very intelligent. They're almost robotic in a lot of their responses. But bees can learn the difference between the concepts of same and different. You can take bees and present them with, you can see it right here, a chamber that has 3 little rooms in it, and then a kind of triangular chamber in the center, which leads to each one. And what you can teach the bee is that whatever pattern or color is around the entry when you first come into this center chamber, that is the one you want to go to in order to get the food over and over and over again. Now, they're not teaching the bee that blue leads to the food. They're teaching it to follow whatever the same pattern is. So they can do it with horizontal stripes and vertical stripes. They could do it with different shapes. They could do it with black and white. They could switch you go in through the yellow and then the food will be behind the yellow chamber instead. What the bee is learning is the difference between same and different. And that requires memory. It has to remember what door it came through when it's presented with these two other options. And it will find the correct chamber to go to after you've taught it, even if you remove the food, right? So it's not just following its nose to get there, it's remembering the trick for solving this puzzle. I love this one. This is a chimpanzee, and I have not sped this footage up. This capture is at the speed that he is doing it. They show him a screen of numbers, and then the second he touches the first number, they all go white, and he has to remember what order these symbols are in. Now, these symbols don't mean anything to the chimpanzee, but he's done this game enough. He knows that 1 is followed by 2, by 3, by 4, by 5, by 6, and then up to 9. And he memorizes them so quickly because he's getting a food reward every single time he solves this puzzle. And it's a little bit of enrichment as well. There's a little bit of fun in problem solving, and I think most of us would be able to relate to that. Chimpanzees can solve other kinds of interesting problems as well. If you were to suspend a banana from the ceiling, right, so that they couldn't reach it, but you leave some boxes in the room, chimpanzees will pick up those boxes and they will place them, stacking them one on top of the other on top of the other, and then climb them to get the banana. In order to do that, they need to recognize a problem, and then they need to imagine a solution to the problem in their head, and then devise a strategy to get that solution actually working. So that's a problem-solving type behavior. Like I said before, we generally don't think about animals as being able to solve problems, but that's because we're kind of rating them by human standards of problem solving. We are presenting them with the kind of puzzles that we like to solve or that we are able to solve. If you present them with something that is within their wheelhouse, then they will surprise you more often than not. I'm going to add a video of a crow solving some interesting complex problems in the playlist right after this. So let's test your knowledge here. I'm going to introduce you to another one of my pets. This is Sammy the rat. And rats have an innate response to run away from the smell of cat urine. I mean, don't we all? But it's particularly important for rats to avoid predators. If you repeatedly expose a rat to that smell with no reward or punishment, it will slowly get used to it, right? And eventually you can even train a rat and a cat to kind of be friends with each other. They will both suppress their inherent associations with fear or hunting behavior, and they will kind of hang out together. So what kind of behavior is this? Pause the video and think about it for a sec, write it down, and then I'll come back and tell you. The behavior is habituation. They are losing their association. He is losing his fear response. The cat's losing its hunting response. They are uncoupling those things in time. So that's a habituation response.